Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Project Arise Fall Workshop Series. This is our second installment, and we're really excited to be joined by TNTP today to share some really rich content with us. And so before they do that, I'm going to share a little information about our grant. First, we want to acknowledge through Project Arise, we have many partners across the state of California who are working with us to provide professional learning for teachers and educators across the state. A special shout out to our colleagues at California Department of Education who are funding the project, and our county partners in San Diego and Glenn County who are helping to coordinate all the work. You'll also be hearing more about our other partners on the next slide. Through this work, we are so excited to offer some free online learning modules that you can take to improve your knowledge around teaching literacy. And so our projects focused on providing these opportunities to all educators in California, including teachers, administrators, and paraprofessionals. And so the focus of our work is to support students who have disabilities or dyslexia, and students who are dually identified. On the next slide, thanks, Beth. Here is the list of our free online learning modules. They are created by our excellent partners and have such an amazing information for all of you that you could go through with your colleagues or your school sites to learn more about supporting students in literacy. Part 1 on executive functions and literacy is brought to us by our partners at the Center for Whole Child Education at ASU. Parts 2, 3, and 4 on the science of teaching reading are brought to you by our partners at TNTP, who will be sharing with you in just a moment. And part 5 is brought to you by the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And that last section is on intensive intervention. So without any further ado, we are so thrilled to have our partners, Alina, Beth, and Tori from TNTP today, and I'll turn it over to Alina.
Michelle. Michelle said, I'm Alina, I'm with TNTP. Really happy to be here along with my colleagues, Beth, and Tori is also in the chat, ready to answer any questions as they come. Again, we're just so excited to join you all for this session around reading foundational skills coming from Project Arise. So the amazing modules that Michelle just referenced. Last week, we were so happy to hear from Jasmine at the center around executive functioning in part 1. Today's session is going to focus on content that comes from part 2 and 3 of our course, focusing on literacy as equity and on foundational skills instruction. Part 4, as Michelle mentioned, is also part of the science teaching reading course from TNTP, although we won't talk through it today. Today, we're really excited to dig into all things reading foundational skills. And so here are our outcomes for today's session. During our time, we're going to identify the key components of effective foundational skills instruction, use the foundational skills instructional practice guide to observe and identify key components in a sample lesson, collaborate with role-alike peers to discuss the conditions needed at your district or school to bring those components to life with students. Our fondest hope is that this session feels more like a workshop. We're going to ask that you roll up your sleeves and look at instruction together, sharing what you know and observe through coming off mute in the chat and also at the end of our session in some breakout rooms. So with that, we'd like to take a moment and just hear who's in the room and start to harness some of that brilliance. So I'm going to ask that you take one moment and in the chat, introduce yourself with your name, your district, and your role. Thanks, Barb, for kicking us off. And I see quite a few more rolling in. Super appreciate that. I'm going to ask that you keep it coming. Again, we really are excited to be in this space with you and want to know who you are and a little bit about what brings you here. I'm going to move us ahead, though, and just show us the agenda for today. We're going to do a quick connector in a moment, then take a look at some key components of research-based foundational skills instruction. Again, use that IPG tool to build some understanding, and then finally have some collaboration time to think about what this means at your role. But when we hear the words foundational skills, we actually know that some things might automatically come to mind. And again, we'd love to draw on the expertise that we know is within this room and get a pulse on how this group defines that term. In other words, when you hear foundational skills, what comes to mind? Beth is going to drop a link in the chat in a moment for a Mentimeter. What we're going to ask is that you type in your response, words or phrases, draft thinking is fine, and get a sense of, in this room, how do we define that term? And it just got dropped in. It's getting dropped in a few more times. Menti.com, and then you're going to enter the code that's in the chat. And thank you, Beth, for taking care of that. Thanks for those who are already having the responses come in. Fluency, phonics, essential, phonemic awareness, beginning, segmenting, print concepts, comprehension, do this first, basic, first, beginning. So super appreciate that, and going to ask again that these responses keep on coming. We're going to start to dig into this, knowing that this is essential, right? And that foundational skills, when we dig in, actually means some really specific things. And it's worth kind of, as educators, taking a moment and a pulse and coming together to think about kind of what that is. So we're going to start by digging into this further. In our Science of Teaching Reading course, in Part 2, Literacy is Equity, we share this image that's on the screen and the research to help our participants understand that all students can become proficient readers. According to the research, a very small minority of students, only 5%, learn to read effortlessly with minimal reading instruction. Another 35% of students learn to read easily and at a rapid pace with some explicit foundational skills instruction. Majority of students, 40 to 50%, require support through explicit and systematic foundational skills instruction. We're going to get into what that means. It'll support developing neural pathways for reading. 10 to 15% of the population require that same explicit and systematic foundational skills instruction with some intensive intervention and many repetitions. On the whole, this tells us that the vast majority of students can learn to read when taught through systematic and explicit foundational skills instruction, as shown in this slide, during their Tier 1 class and when presented with grade-appropriate materials. Why we're here today, and we know what the reality is that those percentages, unfortunately, do not line up with what we're seeing across the state of California and across the country. In California, during the 2021-2022 school year, 42% of third graders were, only 32% of third graders were proficient readers. Excuse me, 42% of third graders. 16% of English language learners met or exceeded the standard in ELA, and 19% of students with IEPs met or exceeded that same standard. What this data tells us is that shifts in practice and development provided to teachers is needed in order to ensure that all students, and in particular, those 85 to 90% that we just identified on the previous slide, become proficient readers through systematic and explicit foundational skills instruction. One visual that we often reference when we think about what the research tells us is called Scarsborough's rope, which is named for Hollis Scarborough, who developed it. Scarsborough's rope demonstrates the interconnectedness of decoding and of language comprehension. What it shows is how various skills in literacy develop over time, with the green ropes at the bottom connected to word recognition. The blue and purple ropes at the top connect to language comprehension. Each of these components consists of several more specific skills and strands that students need to master to become proficient readers, first developing individually, and then interacting with one another. So we might think to ourselves, well, What happens if one of those strands doesn't develop as the others? And our answer is that it all unravels. If you have the language comprehension strand, students will be able to understand the text when it's read to them. If you have the word recognition strand decoding, but kids don't know what the words mean after it's read aloud to them, they're still going to be unable to comprehend the text. Our goal is to develop all of these strands over time so that reading becomes increasingly automatic and readers become increasingly strategic in their understanding of complex text. Our whole Science of Teaching Reading course focuses on not only the visuals we see from Scarsborough's rope, but also on some key best practices in literacy that are supported by research and aligned to those same strands that we just took a look at. For some of you with this course, we know it'll strengthen previous knowledge and experiences, and for others, it might be some new information. When some people hear the Science of Teaching Reading or the Science of Reading, they think only of foundational skills instruction, which is our first practice listed here and what we're going to dig into in today's session. But we know that there are also more practices we need to focus on in order to develop all of those strands of Scarsborough's rope. Key best practices are foundational skills, text complexity, building knowledge and vocabulary through text, and also evidence-based, that reading, writing, and speaking is grounded in evidence from the text. And these practices might look familiar to you because they are also essentially the shifts that came with Common Core standards, based along with a focus on foundational skills. Today, we're going to start focusing and narrowing in on two essential elements of Tier 1 foundational skills instruction. That instruction first is systematic, that it follows an intentional research-based progression. The second thing is that it's explicit, that kids have opportunities to read, write, hear, and say. So through the rest of our time together, we're going to take a closer look at each of these elements, including research on why this really matters for students. We'll start by watching a short clip of foundational skills instruction in action to see if we can look at what makes this systematic and explicit and full of practice in action. So we're going to go to a video of a teacher named Ms. Cuomo. This is a first grade classroom, and we're going to watch 1 minute of strong foundational skills instruction. Then we're going to unpack what we saw as we discuss the key components of foundational skills instruction together. We also want to plug that we know that 1 minute is not a ton of time, but you can see the video in its entirety during part 3 of our course. As we go into watching a video, there's always some norms that we want to be agreed on as a group. First, that we know there's many things that we don't know about the students, the classroom, the shared history of the teachers and students on the video. Generally, we want to assume good intentions and expertise on the part of the teacher. And finally, to keep our observations focused about what students are getting out of the interaction. So we're going to peek into Ms. Cuomo's classroom, watch 1 minute of this instruction, and then we're going to use the chat to talk a little bit about what you noticed.
You give me a thumbs up if you can hear.
And this was the first time today that they were doing IE. Today we're gonna learn a new magic E sound. Just like E makes A say its own name, it's A when they're in a team. This magic E sound is I. Repeat. We're gonna learn how to spell it in a moment, but first I want you to hear it. When I say I, watch my mouth first, and then you're gonna make it and pay attention to what your mouth is doing. I. Repeat. Silent hand, what happens to your mouth? One friend knows, two friends know. We can do it one more time. I. Repeat. I'm gonna read you some words and you're gonna vote yes, thumbs up, I hear the I sounds, my mouth is smiling, or no, I don't hear the I sounds, my mouth is not smiling. Say. Thumbs up or down. Ooh, try it again. Say. Do you hear the I sound? 1, 2, 3, vote. Correct. S-e-y. It's not sigh. What about ice? Repeat. Ice. 1, 2, 3, vote. Do you hear the I sound? Correct. Try cat. Repeat. Do you hear the I sound? Correct. Darius, do you hear the I sound in cat? No, if we tap it out, at. Repeat. There's no I sound. I have some sound riddles. I'm going to show you a picture. And I want you to tell me what word could this be with the I sound. For example, it's not cube because that.
All right, so pausing there, and we're gonna come back to that video at the end of our time together too. I'd love to hear in the chat, how does this connect with your understanding of foundational skills? And if there's any questions that come to mind. Thank you. I know it always takes a minute to type in, but appreciate Sophia kicking us off. Multisensory, directly teaching, letter sound correspondence. I see the word explicit. Thank you for that. A few people. Teacher modeling, checking for understanding, seeing the folks that I can see on the Zoom kind of nodding along to this. So there might be consensus within the group. Repetition, checking for understanding. There's a lot happening within, just this short clip of film. And we know this is actually quite a long lesson that we're only watching just that first introductory minute too. Where we start to see some examples of not only explicit instruction and modeling, but also some sequencing, right? That this instruction that the teacher is giving is actually systematic. So we're going to start to dig into a little bit around what makes this really strong example. And the first thing we're going to start with is thinking about how this is systematic. That materials and instructions should reflect a research-based, standards-aligned scope and sequence. So we want to start by talking about what we mean when we say systematic phonics instruction. And we saw from the video that Ms. Cuomo was following a sequence, not only because in the first part of the video, she had explained students' previous work, but she was also kind of making that connection for students as they were starting to grasp that I sound. When we say systematic, what we mean is instruction that follows an intentional sequence of explicit instruction, building from more easy to more complex skills and with intentional opportunities for research and for review. What this shows us when we take a look at some research is that systematic phonics instruction, it actually produces significant benefits for kids, especially those who are having difficulty learning to read, kids that we would consider striving readers. So let's take a look into some of the research behind why this is. And again, these are things that you can explore within the Science of Teaching Reading Project Arise course. At its highest level, systematic foundational skills instruction reflects something called Ares phases of development. What it tells us is that although students' neural pathways develop at different rates and require different amounts of practice to strengthen, all students develop the same pathways and they all pass through the same phases to move from their natural oral language abilities to become fluent readers. Very codify these stages and they help immensely in deeply understanding not only what instruction should look like for all students, but also where students might get stuck in their development and what interventions to offer to support those students in their reading growth. The 4 stages start with pre-alphabetic, where children learn to read visual cues by memorizing using context. In partial alphabetic, early readers are learning to decode by associating from the letters of words with sounds. In full alphabetic, transitional readers have learned to decode, and when they encounter new words, they can segment it into letter sounds. And then finally, consolidated alphabetic, where readers recognize word parts and letter patterns. And instead of using single letter sound correspondences, they use knowledge of word parts when they encounter new words. Strong instructional sequences support students to move through these 4 stages that are on the screen. For example, in a classroom context, students would start working on phonemic awareness in pre-K. They're usually starting in the pre-alphabetic stage. They add in phonics instruction with single consonant and vowel sounds starting around kindergarten, when most students enter the partial alphabetic stage. Then they focus on more complicated phonemes like blends, 2 words that make a blended sound like look, and digraphs, 2 or 3 consonant letters that make a new sound like sh. As students move towards full alphabetic. Once students move beyond 2nd grade, foundational skills instruction should shift to having a heavier focus on fluency, which supports students in moving from full alphabetic into consolidated alphabetic. So let's take a look at what this might look like in action. Because in addition to supporting movement through RE stages, the sequence with which a scope introduces sounds and spellings really matters. It matters a lot. Not all letters and spellings are created equal. And quite simply, some are utilized more than others. A scope and sequence that spends the same amount of time as the letter X just isn't going to give us as much utility as one that spends a lot of time on the letter N. It needs to be something that allows for a maximum amount of words to form. So I'm going to ask us all in this group to imagine that we are a 5-year-old who's eager to learn to read. If in the first month of your reading program, I taught you the reading skills that are on the top line, S, M, T, D, L. Can I see in the chat how many words could you make? Seeing it come through already, 0. But what if I taught you the skills on the bottom row, S, M, A, T, D? What words could you make with that combination? See Matt, sat, Sam, sad. A lot more words. It's a quick generation of useful words, which is not only more efficient for instruction, but it's also really motivating. When we talk about a strong scope and sequence for foundational skills instruction, what we mean is we want to focus on the highest priority letters first so that students can build words and apply their knowledge of decoding to make meaning of the text right away. They also save multiple letter sounds later on as they start to develop bigger chunks and as that continues to develop. Now, as observers, if we're going into classrooms, we might not always have a full set of information to work from and capture evidence around systematic instruction, but there are some things that we can look and listen for. In the classroom environment, for example, you might see artifacts for evidence of previous learning that could help you determine if a lesson is situated within a systematic scope and sequence of material your district uses and whether or not students have been engaging in this learning before. For example, in Ms. Cuomo's class, we could see if we looked in the background, some past visuals of that magic E sound. You might also hear students or teachers referencing connecting previous learning with things like, yesterday we learned this sound, today we're going to learn this sound. We heard this in Ms. Cuomo's class when she mentioned that she previously taught the magic E and that they were learning a new sound related to that spelling today. You might see things like student workbooks that have a lot of completed pages and things like sounds being developed and tracked in both classroom and student materials. If you create practices to pull up the lesson being taught while you're observing, you can also often tell a lot about the systematic instruction just by looking at those materials. Before we move into our next phase of foundational skills instruction, we also want to talk through some of the biggest challenges when we think about systematic. One of them is if teachers do not have an aligned curriculum with a research-based scope and sequence, or if teachers are supplementing their curriculum with an activity that's actually changing the skill of what students are learning. So one thing to be mindful of as you support teachers in implementing effective foundational skills instruction is that teachers should be extremely cautious of teachers pay teachers as they implement new material. As an example, most phonemic awareness work is going to be oral. And so if a teacher produces PowerPoint from Teachers Pay Teachers, sometimes they put that oral work into print in a way that might actually be confusing to students who are just learning to crack the code, and in a way that might actually change the skill that students are learning and practicing. So for an example, in a basic code lesson on the sound, a strong scope and sequence might prompt students to guess an answer to the following riddle. I'm thinking of something white or green growing in vegetable garden. I'm thinking of a vegetable that causes tears in your eyes, certainly does for mine, when you cook it. I'm thinking of something in which grown-ups bake cookies. I'm thinking of something that gets very hot. The first sound in the words onion and oven is indeed the sound. In these words, it's spelled with the spelling O. But because this is an oral exercise for students, the curriculum intends that students are just practicing isolating a sound. Sometimes a teacher's pay teacher's PowerPoint will intend to support the teacher by putting words on the slide. So for example, teachers might see the words onion and oven instead of just hearing the sound. And not only might that confuse students, but it would actually change the skill. And so as you're observing for systematic instruction, you want to be mindful that we're not only using a lesson that's situated within a research-based systematic scope and sequence, but that any enhancements made to the lesson still maintain the integrity of the skill.
Okay, so I'm going to take over from here. My name is Beth. I'm also at TNTP. And we're going to walk through our second area of focus today, which is explicit instruction. And there are already some examples of this shared earlier in the chat from the first portion of the video. So this is when we see instruction that is explicit, clear, and correct. So as we mentioned earlier, there's a few components that we want to see within this explicit instruction. So we hope to see that every student in a classroom in K-2 is engaged in foundational skills instruction for at least 45 minutes a day. And within these 45 minutes, this includes whole group instruction. It includes student practice with the skills. It also might include small group. But throughout that entire time, all students in the classroom should be getting practice with whatever the target skill is for the day or for the week. Within this instruction and practice, we mentioned this earlier, students should have the opportunity to hear, say, read, and write or spell the new sound spelling pattern during the lesson. So we heard Ms. Cuomo say that within that lesson. We're going to learn to spell it in a moment, but first I want you to hear it. So we heard that practice in that classroom. So we will know that students have learned the sound spelling patterns that they're encountering when they can decode them in a text and when they can produce the sound accurately. And we'll know that they can spell them when they can produce them in writing, whether it's dictated or generated by themselves. But as we mentioned, we first have to start by going through the practice of students hearing the sound. So what we hope this looks like in classrooms is teachers sharing several words with the target sound and asking students to identify the words they hear that contain this. So we saw this in the sample video with Ms. Cuomo, where she said, we're going to read some words and you're going to say, yes, I hear the sound, or no, I don't hear the sound. Giving students some opportunity to physically move in some way in their response as well. I think I saw that come through in the chat as well, some sort of opportunity to engage students in that way when they're responding to hearing the sound. Students also need to practice saying the sounds accurately. And so we hope to see teachers explaining how the sound is made. So explaining the mouth position and how you actually voice the sounds. And then having students practice after by repeating and mimicking that sound. We want to see students having the opportunity to look at each other's mouths when they're saying the sound, to look at their own mouth. If the teacher, some teachers I've seen with those small little mirrors where students can look at their own mouth and see, and ask them to describe what it looks like, and then to generate words with that sound. So this is something we saw in the video as well, when she asked students to say, what happens to your mouth? Students then need an opportunity to practice reading the sounds. So after the teacher has modeled how the sound is spelled, students should read words with the target sound. So initially they're going to read those words in isolation, out of context, and then eventually within context, within a sentence, or potentially within a decodable reader that contains previously taught sounds for the students to practice reading within context. Additionally, students should get practice writing and spelling words with the target sound. Some teachers, when students are within whole group, have students practice writing the sounds in the air as a way to engage all students in the whole group instruction. And then students will eventually get some sort of practice writing with a utensil, a marker, or a pen in hand, possibly on a whiteboard through dictation or through some sort of worksheet from a curricular resource where students can practice writing both the words themselves with the target sound as well as sentences that contain that sound. So we hope to see all of these components within that 45-minute block of time every day. Just some quick examples. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And I do think we have a PDF of our slides that we can share if you'd like to refer back to them. But we like to think about, again, what this looks like, and also keeping in mind what we hope that it doesn't look like in a classroom. And I think that we've talked a bit about sharing whatever the target skill or objective is for the lesson with students and making sure that's really clear and explicit for them. And the second point here is properly pronouncing or articulating the sounds. I can say for myself, this content is incredibly challenging to learn and to then prepare to teach. Many of us don't remember how, I'll speak for myself. I don't remember how I learned to read. I don't remember the proper sound spelling patterns that I was maybe taught, but that helped me to successfully read. And so we really encourage schools and districts, and a lot of the work we do is to support teachers to ensure they feel prepared to properly teach these sounds to students. So through practice and through lesson internalization, so teachers really feel comfortable and confident when they're in front of their students and feel supported to do that work. So I just want to highlight that one in particular. So thinking about what we've talked about related to systematic instruction and explicit foundational skills instruction, well, I'm going to ask you to put into the chat, like we did earlier. Let's say you're talking to a colleague who asks you, what do you mean by systematic instruction? And what do you mean by explicit foundational skills instruction? Take a minute to put into the chat what you would tell someone who wants to know how they can tell if foundational skills instruction is systematic or if it is explicit. And you can choose one or the other, and just add a brief note into the chat of what you would tell somebody, how they could tell if instruction was systematic or explicit. Awesome, thank you. I'm seeing some reference to the scope and sequence skills building on each other. Step by step with modeling, a similar format that's predictable to students, moving from simple to complex. Awesome, thank you so much. So lots of examples here of both systematic as well as explicit instruction. So we're going to transition to the second part. Thank you to those of you that are still adding to the chat. Where we're going to take a look at a tool that you may or may not be familiar with, but that you can use to support teachers and schools and districts in identifying strong foundational skills instruction. And so in just a second, my colleague Tori is going to put into the chat the link to this tool. So this is the Foundational Skills Instructional Practice Guide, or the IPG. And this was developed by our colleagues at Student Achievement Partners. They have tools related to comprehension and literacy, as well as other content areas. But we're going to focus specifically on the foundational skills tool today. So I'm going to ask you, once you've opened it up, if you could take 2 minutes just to read page 1. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to look at another page in a minute. But just take a look at page 1 to read through the description of the tool so that you can think about who this tool is for and how you or others may use this tool within your work. So I'm going to go on mute and give you 2 minutes to open up this link and to read page 1 of the tool. Okay, hopefully during those 2 minutes you had a chance to read the first page. And I'm sure that you encountered within the tool or within the first page that this practice guide, or the IPG, is designed to help teachers and those who support teachers to build understanding and experiences with best practices to support the explicit teaching of foundational skills. So this is a tool that we use at TNTP and is used all over the country. And we really believe strongly that this is a coaching tool to use to develop teacher practice. So we stress this because this is not a tool that is advised to be used in any way to evaluate teacher practice, but is used instead to coach and support teachers. It's great to work with teachers and help them identify an area of focus that they want to work on and work towards setting goals to improve their practice in that specific area before moving on to another one. So I always keep my coach hat on here and really hope that folks embrace this as a coaching tool to support teachers. The practices that are within this entire tool are aligned to the content in our foundational skills modules on Project Arise in part 3. So we are only going to be looking at aligned content and teacher directed instruction today, but the content of the entire tool is aligned to that portion of our course. So as you'll notice, and you've probably started to think about this already when you've read it, their area of aligned content is directly connected to what we've talked about in terms of systematic instruction, and teacher-directed instruction is directly aligned to explicit instruction. So when we are using both of those sets of terms, we're using them interchangeably. So I'm going to give you another 2 minutes now to turn to the next page. Turn because I have it printed. You're going to scroll, I guess, on your screen. You can read page 3, which is the one that's on the screenshot. And if you have time, you can also scan page 2 to look at the indicators of just aligned content and teacher directed instruction. So you don't need to focus on student practice or assessment and differentiation. So just looking at those 2 areas, think about where you see evidence of the key criteria for foundational skills that we were discussing. Also think about what questions you might ask yourself as you're looking for evidence of these indicators within a classroom. So I'll give you 2 minutes to read and think about those questions as you're reading. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to read through that page, specifically focused on aligned content and teacher-directed instruction. I'd love for folks to put in the chat, what questions might you ask yourself if you are looking for evidence of these areas when you're in a classroom? So I'll give you an example where you might ask, what sound spelling pattern is being taught? That's something I might ask myself when I'm in the classroom looking for evidence in these areas. What's another question you might ask yourself? Feel free to put that into the chat. Thank you to those of you putting some questions in the chat. I know they take a bit more of a minute to think about and to type, so I'll give you a little bit longer. Thank you. These are great questions, and I'm going to share a few questions on the next slide, and some of these questions are a bit more specific, and I love them, and I wish we had those exact examples on the slide, but I'm going to share some of them on the next one, and you'll see where some of your questions connect. So this list is by no means exhaustive, but when we're thinking about aligned content, as I mentioned, what is the sound spelling pattern being taught? Is it part of a systematic scope and sequence? If you're not sure about that, the next question is a good one to consider. So is what's being taught aligned to the grade level standards and the time of year? So if you know it is from a research-based, high-quality curriculum, scope, and sequence, you don't need to spend your time going and looking at the standards. But if you're not sure, going and looking at the grade level standards is a really great resource in considering the time of year. So for example, what you would see in kindergarten in September should be very different than what you see in kindergarten in May. And so keeping that in mind as you're looking across the standards and looking at what's being taught. And then this question I saw in the chat, is there evidence of previously learned skills that should be taught prior to this skill? Can you see evidence of that in instruction and in the classroom? And then some of the questions to consider for teacher directed. Are the sounds accurately pronounced and modeled? Are there visual aids or explanations of the rules that are accurate? And do they support and reinforce the skill? So thinking about what was mentioned earlier about supplemental resources that may or may not accurately reinforce the skills. Is the pacing appropriate? Are students spending, I think I saw a question related to this in the chat, but thinking about how much time is being spent on modeling versus practicing. Are students getting an opportunity to go all the way through that, hear it, say it, all the way to a chance to write it? And then finally, are the skills taught through an engaging manner? And I saw this within the chat in terms of some of the specific examples to consider. We often hear that there's a perception that explicit foundational skills instruction can feel really boring. But I actually find in classrooms where it's done really well, it's sort of the opposite. Students, and this was mentioned through some of the comments in the chat earlier, the instruction is predictable to students. They know what to expect. They know that they get to engage by using their voice, often without having to raise their hand. They get to share out whole group. They get to use gestures or move their body. So thinking about the ways that we can see if this lesson is engaging when we're in the classroom, and support teachers when they're not feeling like it's engaging, to think about how to incorporate some of these other multisensory pieces into their instruction. So we're going to move to a little bit of practice, and this is our second portion of the video that we're going to watch. And this is going to be an opportunity to specifically focus on the teacher-directed instruction portion of the IPG. We're going to watch a little bit more of the Miss Cuomo video and think about these indicators as we watch. So I know that this is not always easy if you don't have more than one screen and you don't have it printed out like I do. So I would suggest that you, if you're able to have that page 3 of the IPG open, that way you can see the indicators more detailed as you're watching this video. And a scratch piece of paper, a page of your notebook, somewhere where you can just jot down is usually the easiest as you watch the video. So we are going to tell you that this content is aligned. So this is part of a systematic research-based scope and sequence from the CKLA Amplify curriculum. So you're not going to be observing for specific indicators of aligned content, because we can confirm from the materials that are being used that the content is aligned to first grade and the time of year. But we would like, when you're watching, for you to focus on teacher-directed instruction and specifically jot down any evidence you see of these indicators, as well as any wonderings that you might have that are grounded in the indicators. So we know that no lesson is perfect. And so thinking about anything that you're wondering about as you're watching this as well. We're going to, again, ask you to share these in the chat. And then after that, we're going to be moving into breakout rooms where you're going to have an opportunity to talk with some peers. And I realized I closed the video. Sorry about that. Let me go back to it. That's why I had it here.
Say ice, idea, island. Sometimes the I sound is at the end or in the middle of the word. Say try, fly, pie. Nice. I'm going to show you now how you spell this sound. There's an I. We leave a space for another sound, and then magic E. We're also going to add it to our chart. Does anyone know what word is our example that has the I sound? What's our picture that's going to help us remember what sound these letters make? Dasani? Bike. Say I. Like bike. Cool. You'll also be seeing me do this a lot with my fingers because this I only says I when it's working as a team with Magic E. Magic E makes I say its own name. So if we spell I like this with space for a sound in the middle and maybe a sound in the beginning, how would we spell bike? I'm going to just bring down the magic I, magic E and the I. How would we spell bike? Track. Ooh, I'll choose from the cup to be fair because everyone knows. Jacob? If these are your letters and this is I, how would you spell bike? Can you move them? Oh, what do you think? Are you right or wrong?
Right.
Can you name one friend who agrees with you?
Alex answered now.
I'm still not sure. Can one friend come up? Jacob, you can choose someone with a silent hand, and they'll tap this word out. Remember, hold on, Jacob. You can only choose a friend who knows that when you get to I, you're going to do this. I know it's big. You can do this with your fingers because I only makes that sound when it's with magic E. Choose a friend to touch the letters and sound it out. 3.
Alex.
Alex, come on up. Oh, be happy for him. You could get chosen next time. Good, Jayla. Respond to Alex. Alex, this is correct. I want you to touch each letter like this. I, to check if it's correct. The class will repeat you. But make sure when you're saying it's not B, you can't actually say the real sound very loudly. The last part is a puff of air. Say, B, B. Let's try again. Will you touch the letters? B.
Okay, so as I move back to our slides, feel free to put into the chat something that you might have jotted down as evidence of explicit instruction or teacher-directed instruction from the indicators on the IPG. So think about something that you found that was grounded in the language from the indicators and put that into the chat. Thank you to those of you that are adding in the chat. So thanks to those of you that added. So I'm going to share in just a second a few of these items. I appreciate people that are still adding to the chat. We want to really reinforce one of the things that's really nice about using a tool like this is that you can really narrow the focus of feedback to provide to a teacher. So thinking about the things that they are doing really well in their practice that you can highlight directly related to the tool, and think about narrowing down maybe one indicator for a teacher to focus on moving forward in their practice. So it's, as I think I saw mentioned in the chat earlier, it's fairly concise if you narrow down to specific areas within the tool. So I'm seeing a lot of the things shared that I'm going to put on the next slide just as a quick recap. So as we mentioned, that we know that the content was systematic and aligned. And then there's a few bullet points on here that connect to a lot of what was shared in the chat. And then there were some things that were not necessarily on here that I also see that were shared. So both within this clip as well as in the one we watched earlier, the objective and the sound was articulated to students as well as the rule, and was kind of reiterated through by the teacher in a few ways, as well as through the gesture she would use with her fingers to indicate how to pronounce the word with the sound in it. She was going through the hear it, say it, read it. They were about to spell and to write. I think at the very end, she talks about, I cut it a little short, but they're about to do whiteboards. But they did go through the earlier parts of that. There were clear and accurate pronunciations of the sounds that were shared, the visual aids that supported the skill that was being taught as well. So lots of things that were shared. I'm also seeing some things about just it being engaging for students, lots of different practices there that were embedded that students are obviously familiar with. They're very much a routine, and we're engaging to students. So I appreciate you digging in, doing a little bit of that observing with the tool. Hopefully, if you have not used this before, this might be something that you consider using either with your staff, with a school or district that you work with. But now we're going to give you an opportunity to spend a little bit of time in conversation with colleagues here who might be in similar roles as you through some breakout room discussions. So in just a second, breakout rooms will open up and you're going to be able to self-select into them. And you're going to have about 10 minutes in the room. It's not on the slide here, but I encourage you initially to introduce yourselves to one another in the room. And you can share, your role or anything else about yourself briefly before you start kind of discussing some of these takeaways from the content of our session today. So we also have a Jamboard, which we will put into the chat, and that the Jamboard will have these questions because I know that the slides will disappear when you go into a breakout room. So thinking about this foundational skills observation tool and the indicators we talked about, where do you see strengths already in your school or your district within the work that you do connected to these indicators? And then where do you see 1 to 2 areas of focus in your work connected to these best practices we talked about today and foundational skills? Connected to that, what conditions do you feel are necessary to bring these best practices to life in your school, in your district, or in your work? So what are some structures that you might be considering trying or you have tried or that you want to learn from others in your group that might support bringing some of this work to life in your role. And then just overall, what did you see that affirmed your practice today and your previous knowledge, and what might have challenged you or is challenging you to consider doing something different in the future? So when the rooms open up, you're going to see various categories. There's a category for those of you that work at the county level, for those of you that work at a district level, for those of you that are a leader within a school, whether it's a principal, assistant principal, or an instructional coach, as well as a room for teachers. So feel free to find a room that most closely matches your role and a conversation you'd like to be a part of. I included that we don't have an introduction on here, so feel free to introduce yourself. You also may want to, because we have a little bit more time, you may want to spend a minute or two thinking about what you might want to share and adding that to the Jamboard first before you start sharing, if that's something you need to process, or maybe you just want to start talking because you have a lot that you all want to share. So I think we are ready to open the breakout rooms, and you have that Jamboard. Make sure you open that up.
Thanks,
Tori, are we
Beth.
ready?
Yeah, and I'm just going to chime in with
Hopefully you enjoyed the conversations that you had with some new friends. And I want to thank the teacher room for letting me listen in. I'm super motivated and excited by the work that you all are doing and the shift that it sounds like you've been making in your school. So thanks for letting me listen in and for joining after a long day of teaching. So this is the end of our session. We want to really thank you for joining, everybody here, and taking the time out of your super busy day at the end of hopefully this is the end of your busy day. If not, thank you even more for joining. Our contact information is there on the screen. If there's anything that you need, feel free to reach out. But I am going to pass it to Nicole, who's going to close out our session for us. So thanks so much.
Great, thank you. Beth, Alina, and Tori, really appreciated the knowledge that you shared to us today about foundational skills and really preparing ourselves to be the best teachers on this in this area. And to remind everyone, we have those free online learning modules that were talked about earlier. Michelle's going to drop or has already put a link in the chat to register. Part 1 was highlighted in last week's workshop by Jasmine Hernandez Lavezo. There she is in the corner at the Center for Whole Child Education, and supported by Gretchen. Thank you very much. All right, parts 2, 3, and 4 have been created by TNTP. That's the organization that brought you today's great presentation. And part 5, which is happening next week, is an opportunity to explore data-based individualization by Project Arise's partners at the National Center for Intensive Intervention. And they'll be leading that last workshop that we have next week, and we invite you to join. In the chat, Michelle is dropping a link so that you can register for that. And as a reminder, the sessions are being recorded as people are leaving. Just to remind you, we know that best of intentions, you would love to fill your days with all good things, teaching and learning, but our times are limited. So those will be recorded. If you want any more information about the modules and Project Arise, you can join our listserv, get updates, newsletters, and opportunities. We also have our website available and has lots of information all in one place. And always you can email us if you have any questions about Project Arise. So we want to thank everyone for taking the time after a very full day to join us as we work together to make literacy a reality for all our students. Thank you, Beth, Alina, Tori, for sharing your expertise with us. And it's very timely. We appreciate you. All right, have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.